is on climate adaptation and resilience, from concepts to application, practical applications. So it's going to be a very interesting side event because we have highly level expertise from different institutions and from global to the other levels, and therefore we should be able to learn quite a bit. Now, we have a very tight program in the sense that we're going to have the first 3 papers or so, few remarks from Bruce from IDRC, who's the program leader, and then we are going to have Dr. Yusuf Nassef, represented by Dr. Florin. He's a good friend of mine, so because we did a lot of work with him in agriculture. And then we're going to have who's going to share with us the status of negotiations on adaptation reporting and global stocktake. And then we have Edith, who's from IDRC, who's going to share with us a background paper on the state of art on measuring adaptation and resilience with gender considerations. And with that, I want to welcome Bruce to take charge of this particular segment. Bruce.
Thank you, George. Welcome, bienvenue, Bula. I can't say more than has already been said about the name of this session, which is a mouthful. But let me sort of first recognize that this is itself a session that results from a light partnership amongst a number of institutions that have an interest in this topic. Obviously IDRC, but McGill University, the University of Leeds, University of Notre de Lac, the Asian Institute of Technology, and the UNEP DTU partnership. So joining our ideas to give you the intellectual feast you're about to partake in. Myself, I represent Canada's International Development Research Centre, IDRC, an organization that is trying to fund researchers driving global change. And this is something we're all driving towards in this event. Let me just take a step back. What is the purpose? What are the key questions that are driving us here today? What we hope to address through the panel and through the presentations you're about to hear is how do we identify effective adaptation? We talk about adaptation a lot, but what makes it effective or not? And when you get beyond that question, what is the state of the art in measuring adaptation? What does it mean for assessing projects, for being able to identify what are different options, comparing them over time? What are the remaining gaps and potential solutions towards meaningful reporting and the global stocktake that's ahead of us? These are weighty issues. We still have some of those gaps, but we have some hope. We have some potential solutions to offer you. So without further ado, I will turn it over, as was mentioned by my colleague, to Dr. Florin Vladu, UNFCCC, Manager of Adaptation, to tell us a little bit about status of negotiations and what science can contribute. And then Edith will be filling in the gap with what is some of the state of the art and the principles of what to do, how to do, and where do we go next. Thank you. The floor is yours.
So, as was already said, I'm standing in for my boss, which is Yusuf Nassef, the director of the adaptation program. There was requested to talk a bit about the status of negotiation on adaptation and reporting and the global stocktake. Yeah. So my first slide, I was trying to project is to tell you a few words about the global stocktake before trying to explain where are we with the negotiations. Yeah. As you know, the global stocktake, it's an important element of the Paris Agreement, and it's part of what some people call the ambition cycle, or the improvement cycle. Some tend to use ambition for mitigation and improvement for adaptation. Yeah? If you look to this diagram, it's basically like an input-output diagram. So we have some inputs on the left side, a process in the middle, and the outputs on the right side. Yeah. So on the left side, in the Paris Agreement and the decisions which accompany the agreement, we already agreed on some inputs, and those are listed there, such as IPCC report, as well as effectiveness of the overall effect of NDCs and state of adaptation efforts, yeah, and reports from the subsidiary bodies. Now, if you look to the process, we agree that the process, the global stocktake process, will end in 2023 and will have a cycle of 5 years. And this would take stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement and these long-term goals. And this will be done in a comprehensive manner. By comprehensive, we understand mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And this will inform, it will be facilitative. It will inform parties in submitting their next NDCs. Yeah? As you see, the outcome is expected from the global stocktake is informing parties with a view to increase their ambition, as well as enhancing it, in international cooperation. Yeah? So this is what has been agreed, and you have to see this as part of the full cycle, which will include also the submission of NDC, National Determined Contribution, as well as the Enhanced Transparency Framework, and then the actions which will take place after that. Okay, so now it's a crowded diagram which is trying to respond to what you asked, which is what is the reporting for adaptation, and how this is going to inform the global stocktake. Yeah? Basically, keep in mind the input-output diagram. So we see here on the first 3 blue shapes, yeah, you have the adaptation communication, which can have various vehicles, as you know, the NAPs, so the National Adaptation Plans, the National Communications, and the NDCs, the NDC parts of adaptation part of NDCs. What would be the content of this adaptation communication? It's under negotiation. Is the APA item 4. As you know, they had a roundtable, and they talk about themes of this content, which includes purpose, elements, vehicles, linkages, and then flexibility and others. Yeah. So this discussion continues, trying to figure out how to bring all this information together, and then the information will be stored in a registry, which is the next step. It's under negotiation also under SBI, the subsidiary body for implementation, and from there, the Paris Agreement indicates that we would extract information on the state of the adaptation effort, support, experiences, and priorities. Yeah? There is a second vertical line of inputs, which is linked to the Enhanced Transparency Framework. This is also under negotiation. And here you have 3 steps in this process of reporting, then verifying, technical expert review, and then multilateral facilitative consultation on this. Now, the second and the third steps are dotted because they do not apply to adaptation, they apply to mitigation, but we wanted to have them there to just have a complete picture. Yeah? But this is under negotiation under APA item 5. Yeah? Again, they had roundtables, and the Enhanced Transparency Framework deals with mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation, all 3 elements. Yeah? From there, you have the extracted information, again, the blue lines. Now, we think another line of inputs and the reporting towards looking at adaptation under the global stocktake would come from IPCC. IPCC reports have been agreed as input into the global stocktake. And now IPCC, as you know, finished the scoping of the new reports. There are 6, and they have the working group 2 on adaptation, as well as 3 special reports which have elements on adaptation. I mean, the 1.5 report has impacts at 1.5, 2 degrees, and then you have oceans and cryosphere and land and climate change, the 3 reports. There was a negotiation with the color pink there, underneath the last big block, which was on how to consider the IPCC reports in the global stocktake, and the negotiation was on the substat. They concluded with some recommendations for APA to consider. Now, the yellow block contains four elements which are coming from the Article 7.14 of the Paris Agreement. I've seen Edith will also present some of those elements. So the first is the global goal and the review of the global goal on adaptation. Then you have recognition of adaptation efforts by developing countries. Then adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action and support. And the last one is basically, I think, an outcome, enhance the implementation of adaptation action. It will be an outcome. So only 3 basically would require inputs. Yeah. Now, on the right-hand side of the diagram, you see these two boxes which are representing the work of the Adaptation Committee and the LEG on preparing modalities for recognizing efforts and methodologies for adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action and support. So I think this provides you a clear picture of the reporting part. Yeah. Now, what will be done under the Global Stocktake? The next question is, what did Global Stocktake do? Those negotiations are ongoing, and we are basically only talking about procedural things there. We are not really talking on how the adaptation goal will be evaluated and what methodologies we'll use. Now we are talking about how this process would look. Would it have a technical phase? Would it have a preparatory phase? Or it will be called information gathering and compilation, or somehow differently. We will do it in work streams or not. It's like mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation in parallel with links in between them, or in only one work streams with teams inside. Would we end up with a declaration or the decision or recommendation, or would we have a political phase or not, a ministerial at the end? And all these are discussed. What will be the duration? When do we start? How we check the information we receive, and so on. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure. I was planning. Do I have more time or no? I wanted to also tell you a few words about the work of the Adaptation Committee and LEG, yeah, and how they went about these things. And you see, this was a work which was started in 2016, and they had 3 steps. They looked to gathering information and synthesizing this on, for example, methodologies for assessing adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action and support. This was done with a desk review, call for submissions, identifying possible methodologies, validating them with presentations to parties and stakeholders, and making a recommendation. Yeah. So they had those two tasks, one on recognizing the efforts of developing countries, where they made a recommendation, which is basically to prepare a report every year, collect this information every year from different events, prepare a report, and before the Global Stocktake, prepare a synthesis of all this. So in every year they will have a report, and then have a technical discussion and a high-level event in the Global Stocktake, in a nutshell. On the adequacy and effectiveness, it was a bit more complicated, and I have 2 slides here trying to say things with what kind of questions they ask by themselves. What is adequacy? What is effectiveness? How do you measure effectiveness? Then this has to be done at the national level. What can you do at the national level? What can you do at the international level? How do you aggregate all these things together? So they have a couple of documents where they try to present this. And their final recommendation now is that this needs more work. So whatever you do now, it will help with the discussions. This probably will be available there. In the meantime, other groups are looking to, how to monitor progress on adaptation with indicators. They talk about indicators and indicators in general, or indicators by sectors and so on. But keep in mind the model which I've tried to tell you at the beginning. If this process is to be based on submissions from parties of this information, I pretty much doubt that we will ever have all this information collected from all parties, and then we will be able to aggregate them in a way which would make sense. So probably there have to be very flexible methodologies, very qualitative, to try to put everything together. So more or less, I think this is what I wanted to talk. And the last one is it's about trying to bring together all the Sendai framework and the SDG goals, yeah? And there are already activities happening at the regional level, like in islands where they already started to have some regional pathways for this, and the national level. At the international level, we expect all these discussions which we have on progress on adaptation and everything will lead into further clarification of the goal 13, which is ours. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Could I please have my presentation up by Edith? Thank you. So my presentation will focus on the state of the art, on measuring adaptation, and I'll just try and give a quick overview. Please, if I could have my presentation up. Thank you. So I think I'll pick it up very well from where Florine left. I think that's the wrong presentation. It should be under the name Edith. Thank you. Yeah. So I will basically give a quick overview on the status of where we stand in terms of what we have in the literature on measuring progress on adaptation. I think I'll start as he looks for the presentation. So I think the question we need to ask ourselves, which I think Florine has touched, is why do we want to measure adaptation? I think it's quite clear in the process and in the negotiations so far that adaptation is key, especially for developing countries, and adaptation is required to respond to the challenges of climate change. We've seen that there's a lot of support in terms of financial support being mobilized towards adaptation. And then within the Paris Agreement, we have commitments to the Global Stocktake, which Florine has mentioned. And what do we need to know? We need to know, I'll pick on two things. One, that adaptation is occurring. So in other words, we're looking at the process. And secondly, that it is having the desired effect. So we're looking at what are the outcomes, what's the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation. Oh, thank you very much. Okay. The next point, if you look at the Paris Agreement in terms of the global stocktake, according to Article 7 of paragraph 14, there are 4 purposes for carrying out the global stocktake. The first is recognizing adaptation efforts of developing countries. So in other words, monitoring and evaluating progress, both process and outcomes at the country level. 2 is enhancing the implementation of adaptation action, and of course taking into account the adaptation communications, and then reviewing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support provided for adaptation. So evaluating whether adaptation is actually occurring, and finally, review of the overall progress made in achieving the global goal on adaptation. So looking at the aggregation at the global level. So taking into consideration the individual efforts, but collectively, what are we achieving at the global level? I guess the next question we need to ask ourselves, why is it hard to measure adaptation? We've identified a number of issues. One, I would call it conceptual. One of the challenges are conceptual, which to some extent there's no consensus on definition. Secondly, it's context specific. So even if vulnerability reduction is a widely accepted concept, what this means varies from place to place. The third point is that there are long timelines, and also it refers to a future event. So you can't be sure if the actions today will have the desired effect in the future. So one of the challenges is a conceptual challenge. The second challenge, it's a methodological challenge. And I think to some extent, you touched on it, Florine. In terms of methodologically, if you look at the baselines, because adaptation is a process, the baseline may appear to be a moving target, unless you probably want to look at vulnerability and use vulnerability as a basis. The second thing is looking at avoided losses. It's difficult to measure avoided losses, especially when they're partial. If you look at that picture, that's a picture in Ethiopia where the government anticipated challenges with the flood, and they did put some measures in place. But the measures, because you are not able to tell what the effect is, the stock that they put in place was not enough when the event actually happened. And they required international assistance to supplement what they have. So I think that illustrates the challenges of being able to anticipate the loss in advance. The last challenge in measuring and why measuring adaptation is difficult is an empirical one. One is availability of data. It's typically project-based, so geographically very variable from one place to another. Comparability of data is a challenge. And finally, the potential to aggregate data because of the scale specificity of the indicators. This table gives just a snippet of a few approaches that one would see in the literature. You will notice on the left is then you have the examples, for example, the adaptation tracking tool. You've got tracking, adaptation, and monitoring development. So these are just examples of some of the approaches that are in place. What you will notice is that they differ in terms of scale. There are those that focus on local, those that focus on global and national. They have differences in terms of concepts, in terms of definition, in terms of adaptation priorities. There are differences in methods and data. So already you have a big mix when you're looking at the existing approaches. Now into what kind of framework would we propose? So taking into consideration that at the national level, you're looking at what are their priorities, what their interests, and at the same time, you've got the interest of aggregating this globally. One of the criteria that we could take into consideration is what is the goal that we want to achieve? So looking at issues of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation. Are we progressing towards that goal? So in other words, we are monitoring the process and the outcomes. And then are we doing so efficiently? Efficiently, some may look at efficiency in terms of value for money, but it depends on a country. A country may also want to look at effectiveness as a value judgment issue. For example, equity becomes important. Gender could be a consideration. Are we reaching the poorest? Are we reaching those who are most vulnerable? There's also the issue of minimax, which is, are we willing to reduce the losses from a smaller, more regular events instead of, and are ready to shoulder bigger burdens? So for example, if you take flooding as an example, some countries may say we would like to protect ourselves against the extreme events and to minimize the extreme events that don't occur more often compared to those that occur frequently. Others may want to look at it the other way around, that we would rather shield ourselves against the more frequent ones and are ready to absorb the more longer ones. So really this depends on the boundaries of the risk tolerance of each country. So you need to look at that as well when you're looking at the criteria and the framework. This is not moving. I don't know what the Okay, good. So I guess the next thing we need to ask ourselves, what does the Paris Agreement say in terms of the adaptation goal? It says that parties hereby establish the global goal on adaptation, which will focus on three things: enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal. So in other words, it's more very normative in terms of the three objectives that the Paris Agreement is looking at. So how do I go back? Okay, so in terms of the framework, and I'm almost getting to the end, so this is the proposed framework, a framework for measuring effectiveness of adaptation. We're looking at a four-step approach. One is to describe the adaptation context. So, and this is applicable at any scale, whether you're looking at local or national. And then defining the adaptation priorities, creating an adaptation theory of change, and then having tangible goals or targets. You will see a note down there where we are saying it's applicable at any scale, but particularly relevant to the Paris Agreement. It can be used across countries for comparison and also for the global stocktake with minimum effort on the part of the developing countries. So in other words, you're trying to reduce the burden of reporting, but at the same time ensuring that at the local level they can define what is important for them, identify what the targets are, and then be able to monitor progress with that in mind. The question is, why is this framework novel? And this is my take-home message. I don't know how this works. It doesn't seem to like me. Okay, so why is this framework novel? Two reasons. One, you're able to define adaptation priorities, and these adaptation priorities, because they are defined at the local level, it helps us address the conceptual challenge of definition. In terms of determining adequacy, it looks at, it's relative to the adaptation context in terms of adequacy. In terms of effectiveness, it looks at whether adaptation is occurring or not within that context. Secondly, it overcomes a traditional hurdle of comparability. Countries, or whichever unit of analysis you choose, use nationally determined adaptation priorities as opposed to this universal definition that we are trying to struggle to grapple with and trying to define the methodology to help us get there, rather than focus on what is it that's my priority. And within that priority, am I making progress towards achieving that? And that we believe with this, we'll be able to contribute to the global stocktake by actually aggregating these across the countries. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
At this point, I'd like to invite our panel to come up. I'll briefly introduce them, and they'll be going at it one at a time. Of course, you already have seen George. Sorry, just comparing my notes. Wamukoya, who's with the Adam Smith Institution. He'll be our moderator and providing a bit of flavor for the rest of the afternoon. We'll be going from the local to the global and being able to look across what are the threads that connect these. So we'll be starting off with Liam Villacorta from the Asian Institute of Technology, along with Dr. Anh Do, who is the Director of Climate Change Research at the Vietnam Institute for Meteorology, Hydrology and Environment. Following that will be Nick Steinberg from 427 on downscaling adaptation indicators, drawing on the work of Notre Dame. We'll follow that by Dr. Leah Barang-Ford with Track 3, the Adaptation Tracking Consortium, on the challenges of scaling up to the global level at the stocktake and potential solutions. And then following, but no way means last or least, is Anne Olhoff with UN Environment, the head of Climate Resilient Development, who will be drawing on the adaptation report and defining what it is, what we want to measure at the end of it. So, our colleagues from Asia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, colleagues, Florin has to go away because he's sitting in a session at 4 o'clock. And we just ask if there's any question that or clarification that you think he needs to clarify before we release him. Any one or two? Florin, you remember the landscape of what's happening in the negotiations before he goes away? Any clarification that you may want? Florin, looks like you are very clear, everyone is happy. So thank you very much. So please come.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anh from Vietnam Institute of Meteorology, Hydrology and Climate Change. So it's very honor for me to be here today, so to share with you the story that we have done in Vietnam for adaptation measurement and how it contributes to the National Adaptation Plan. So as you know, Vietnam is one of the countries that most vulnerable to climate change, and under pressure of global stocktake and developing the National Adaptation Plan, Vietnam need to have a tool to measure the adaptation efforts. However, at this moment, we don't have yet the adaptation tracking system. In the other word, you can say we don't have yet the MRV or MNE system. So it's necessary to have one, and that's the reason we collaborated with the Asia Institute of Technology to develop the indicators to measure the adaptation effectiveness in Vietnam. So to understand the efforts at national level, we should understand it at local level, at provincial level. So in this study, we pick Hậu Giang is a case study. Hậu Giang is a province at Mekong Delta, one of the most vulnerable to climate change in Vietnam. So in this study, we develop a set of indicators, and we keep in mind that we can get from Edith presentation about how hard to measure the adaptation. There's several reasons, and especially at provincial level in developing country, for example, in Vietnam, is tougher because the lack of knowledge in adaptation and lack of the capacity, technological capacity, financial capacity to collect data. So it's more tougher to do it at the provincial level in Vietnam. So we keep in mind that. So when we develop the indicators, we try to make it simple and make it easier for people to collect the data. So we can, so that it's more feasible to apply it at local level. So for Hậu Giang, can somebody put up my presentation slide? So anyways, we developed a set of indicators which have 4 categories. The first category of indicator we have is indicator about climate parameters. So we try to understand what climate condition, what extreme events happens in the local. And from that, we have the second categories about climate change impacts in the province. So what type of impacts of climate change to social economic activities in the provincial level, and what the level of those impacts. And then we have indicators to measure the implementation or the progress of the adaptation action to see how the adaptation action their progress and how it reflect toward the strategy or the target of the local level and even the national level. And also we have indicators to evaluate the outcome of climate change adaptation. So with this set of indicators, we can access the effort of adaptation in different categories, different fields at the provincial level. For example, in Hậu Giang, we try to to understand the adaptation effort of Hậu Giang in 7 fields like infrastructure, water resource management, biodiversity, and etc. So we apply it, and we think it's very promising. We got very promising results, and people at the local level can apply it. So we kind of happy with the indicators that we develop. So we believe this set of indicators can be can provide for the provincial decision makers a view or information about how much effort they put into the adaptation in their province or in their at their location, and see what the gaps there and what the challenges there. And also with the information, those information can very support the decision maker at the national level, so they can understand what happened in the local, and so they can adjust the policy, or for example, in the national adaptation plan, they can understand which adaptation measure can be integrated or mainstreaming into the policy or strategy to adapt efficiently for climate change in Vietnam. So this is my story about climate change adaptation measurement in Vietnam.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with such esteemed experts. I'm presenting today on behalf of Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. I am a user and practitioner of a lot of the data that Notre Dame provides. So I was asked to fill in for a colleague, Chen at University of Notre Dame. And I work for a company called 427. We're a small adaptation consulting firm based in the Bay Area. I'll be speaking in the context of working at the city level, largely in urban areas, and some lessons learned for applying adaptation indicators at that scale. So just some visual examples of type of outcomes we're trying to achieve when we're mapping adaptation or we're measuring adaptation. Really the goal here is to show disparities and inequities across space with the ability to make site level, local decisions. This is some of our partners down in the lower half there that we've worked with. Very different contexts in the US and international, obviously, largely due to data availability, which I'll speak to. Now, before I dive into this, I just want to make a couple quick points. The indicators that we use for adaptation and adaptive capacity are really only as good as the outcomes they inform. We work a lot with indexes, and we have to be very careful that these indexes, these composite indexes that can contain dozens of indicators, apply locally. And that's because there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The impacts of climate change are very local. The effects are pathway dependent. It's a very academic way of saying we have to be very aware of our local setting. Adaptation indicators should also be very local as well. So cities come to us and they ask, what's the best adaptation indicator? How do I measure the completeness of readiness in my particular area? What indicator is better than another? And how do I measure this so that I can make decisions on the ground about infrastructure and who should be sitting at the table? Now, these are very tough questions for us to answer because this is a young field. We don't have those answers quite yet, especially working from the research and data perspective. So my answer here is, and you're going to be quizzed on this, go by 3 large guiding principles that at least we've used as practitioners. Stick to design principles, process guidelines, and performance guidelines. And I'll talk about each of those really quickly here. So What is downscaling? If any of us are in the room works on climate impact models or GCMs, we know it's just taking a broad, coarse, conceptual idea and shrinking it to a local level, adjusting the parameters so it measures something locally and does it in a meaningful way. So Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index provides this really high-level framework, and I can show you if you can see the graphic here. Oh, that went way too far. There we go. Top left graphic there, the lower half, that turquoise color there, that measures readiness. And this is a slightly different framework than we're used to from the IPCC. What it's measuring is exposure, sensitivity, and readiness. And it's a very holistic approach to looking at local conditions. Many cities can't control the risk or environmental externalities that are driving a lot of the impacts locally, but what they can change are the economic and social conditions. So this framework allows for those measures. Now, what have we learned? We've learned that transparency is always key. Sitting down with officials that make decisions about adaptation interventions, we have to be very transparent about the limitations of those methodologies and those indicators. Again, we have to understand that the impacts are local, but we also have to measure this at a scale that's usable. I work at the city level, and oftentimes you have to get down to the city block level for any kind of decision to be made about return on investment in order to achieve buy-in at the city level. So we're literally going down to a 3 or 4 block radius. And we've worked with cities like the city of Denver in Colorado, and we're literally developing neighborhood plans, about 13 of them within the entire city, each about 3 or 4 city blocks. And the purpose there is so we don't compromise residents' beliefs, and we also don't compromise the data. Also important, like I mentioned before, we have to measure inequities. Cities can't really control what's happening externally, but they can control a lot of the social and economic disparities across space. So if we're able to measure that disparity, we're able to say something really meaningful. And then lastly there, mind the gap. This here, if you're a researcher, you understand, we can't always use the data that's available on the web through desktop research or what's provided or even through surveys. I would point a lot of people to remote sensing data and satellite information. And I'll show you just a quick example of that. That image down there on the bottom of the screen shows a 500-year event of rainfall. And it shows normal conditions on the left, the 500-year event on the right. This map isn't previously available anywhere. You can't get this from a local flood map. You can't get this from a lot of our national flood insurance maps. But through satellite information, we're able to fill some of those data gaps that have existed long before us. So I just want to close by saying a lot of these best practices that I mentioned can be very elusive because things change. Frameworks change, data changes, and most of all, people change, right? We're not always working with the same people year to year, and we're coming across new frameworks, new ideas, new ways of understanding what adaptation and adaptive capacity really is. So we have to be flexible to that. And we should acknowledge that adaptive capacity indicators are only as good as the outcomes that they inform. But we can improve the reliability of these indicators if we really stick to those key principles. Thank you.
I'll present from here if that's okay. Podiums are always so high for me. So I'd like to do the exact inverse of what Nick just did. Instead of talking about scaling down adaptation indicators, I'd like to talk about scaling up adaptation indicators. So what do we do when we want to endeavor to take a global stocktake and look at global collective adaptation progress? This introduces a totally different set of challenges. I am a researcher based at the University of Leeds, and about 7 years ago, some colleagues and I asked the question, are we adapting? How do we know when we're collectively adapting? So this started a research program basically looking at opportunities to answer this question systematically. So how do we begin to systematically answer a question which really requires the gathering together of different bits and pieces from different countries, different regions, different vulnerability contexts, and answering that question in some sort of meta or grand synthesis, which is exactly what the Paris Agreement has now enshrined. So during the first few years, we went for what I would call the low-hanging fruit. So we looked at how either the scientific literature or national communications or other already publicly available documents could be used to synthesize an answer to, are we adapting? And we spent quite a bit of time on this, looking at global distribution of global adaptation reporting, what cities are talking about adaptation, what are countries saying about adaptation, and can we begin to map adaptation globally? After several years of this, however, we became dissatisfied because we realized that we were ultimately either dealing with very crude proxies of adaptation, which didn't feel like they were actually measuring meaningful adaptation, or we weren't really being in any way systematic about our assessment. So we would just be looking at what people happen to say and call adaptation. So essentially in the last few years, we went back to the drawing board and started doing a bit more thinking to think about what questions we need to be asking in order to answer the are we adapting grander question, but also what types of data do we need? Where will those data come from? And I think this is not a problem of not having enough indicators. There's plenty of indicators and metrics out there. It's which ones do we want? What indicators do we not have that we need? And how do we go about assembling these in a systematic way to answer this metasynthesis question that is the global stocktake? So some of the resolutions we came up with. On the slide here, you see pieced apart, and this is very similar. This is similar to what Edith showed you as well. There's some consistency here, starting with national vulnerability. So what is the context of a nation? What are their vulnerabilities? And everything really needs to be evaluated vis-a-vis this. The reason there is no one-size-fits-all adaptation assessment and required adaptation is because countries have different vulnerability profiles. They also have different capacity to adapt. Countries then have national adaptation goals and targets, and enshrined in the Paris Agreement is that the international community does not make those decisions for countries. Countries make those decisions themselves. And adaptation efforts and adaptation results. This slide has just articulated a couple of the overarching questions that we need to ask that really, in order to do a synthesis, we need to know this type of information from different countries. What are key areas of vulnerability? What are a country's national adaptation goals and targets? How are countries making decisions on adaptation? So this is a bit of a governance question. And what are countries actually doing? And finally, what has resulted from these activities? So these are very descriptive questions. And I intentionally do this because I think a large barrier has been our attempt to intermingle the what is going on from the what should be going on. And we need to separate those in order to move forward. So now I've layered on the evaluative component. This is what you might call normative. And here the question is, how do we get at effectiveness and adequacy? These are really, really messy constructs. And what we're proposing here is that this needs to be based on concepts of alignment. The way that we judge actions and adaptation efforts is based on the extent to which they are aligned with targets. We don't tell countries what they should be doing. They define what they would like to do, and we can judge whether they've done that, or we can evaluate that. Same thing, are targets aligned with vulnerabilities and resources? You can look for alignment and avoid some of the more normative questions. There's sub-questions within here that we can ask, but very distinctly separating the what is going on from the what should be going on. A bit messier is linking outcomes to adaptation efforts. There's a lot of effort to look at concepts of attribution, which is quite a tangled mess when you break down the theory behind that. What's becoming more popular is a focus on contribution. And this will likely be, anything in red, I would argue, will likely have to be qualitatively, though it could be systematically collected. As far as the implications for metrics and indicators, anything in black here is probably can potentially be quantified using either existing reporting through the UNFCCC or publicly available data or third-party data collection. Anything in red, I would argue, is probably going to be predominantly qualitative, again, through either reporting within the UNFCCC from nations, either through third-party expert stakeholder review, or from publicly available data. And there's quite a few different options here, but I think we have to get the questions right first. And there's one more thing I wanted to add that I didn't put on this slide, is that we want to assess progress, which means there has to be, the indicators we select need to reflect change. And to a large extent, most of the indicators we look at are not reflecting change. We don't tend to look for how have things progressed. We tend to just ask what is going on now. And that makes a huge difference. Some countries may start from a very low baseline but make huge progress, while other countries may start from a higher baseline and make little progress. So the distinction in our indicators between static and change is actually quite important when we begin to develop the indicators associated with these frameworks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Anne Olhoff. I work with the UN Environment DTU Partnership, a UNEP collaborating center based in Denmark. And today, now we're going back to the global level. We have slowly progressed back towards the global level. And I want to share with you a little bit of information from our very brand new third Global Adaptation Gap report produced by UN Environment, which we will actually be launching tomorrow here at 6:30 in meeting room 12. And it actually, I have the advantage of having Edith was on the steering committee of the report, and Leah is one of our lead authors as well. So I'm in good company. So now we've heard about the global goal on adaptation, we've heard about the global stocktakes, all the needs and all the challenges about getting the information and how we're actually going to assess progress on adaptation. So we know the global goal is basically very broad, it's still very undefined, and it's really difficult to measure. So what are the good news? And I think the good news is that we have a global goal on adaptation. It has moved our whole approach and understanding, or it can move our understanding of adaptation, what constitutes adaptation, what constitutes progress, what is it that we mean when we talk about vulnerability reduction, capacity development, and resilience. So it gives us a new starting point and really a new impetus for establishing a much better understanding of adaptation and of adaptation progress and of what works and what does not work. And this is not just under the UNFCCC and under the negotiations, and it cannot only be based on what parties to the convention are going to be reporting in their adaptation communications. We all need to contribute, and we need to include all stakeholders that work within this area, including, of course, the parties to the convention, but also practitioners, countries, and researchers and civil society organizations. We all have part of the picture. And I think the presentations preceding this one has amply showed that a lot is going on, and we know a lot already. It's about getting it to the next level and to be more clear about what is it that we think is important when we talk about these very broad topics of vulnerability and climate resilience. How can we make things more comparable? How can we address some of the really crucial issues about what is working and what is not working? How can we look across different countries, across different places, and over time about what is happening? And that requires comparison. It requires indicators that are comparable and consistent, and that we also can measure over time and across different places. That's not easy, but we have a lot to work from, including a lot of the work that's going on at the national level, where more than 40 countries already have established national monitoring and evaluation systems on adaptation, and where there's a lot of information coming out. And also, I think, even though these systems amply illustrate the diversity of approaches and the differences between indicators that countries choose to use and the different purposes, indeed, for which these national systems are established, they also show convergence. We see the same in the national determined contributions, the ones that included adaptation components. There was a huge convergence in terms of the most prioritized risk areas across countries, sectors that countries are focusing on, and it gives us a really good basis for starting to have a discussion about maybe we can never find the ultimate measurement or indicator or metric for adaptation and for vulnerability and so forth, but we do have quite a good common understanding about what are the key components, what is it really important at the country level, but maybe also at a global level. What do we all agree is really important to look at and to track progress against if we want to make advances and really succeed in countries becoming less vulnerable over time. So we talked a lot about the different sources of information. Florian also started out by saying there are limitations to how much we can expect the individual national adaptation communications to include in terms of information that will also be aggregable across countries. So, and Leah also mentioned the many different sources that we have, and Florian mentioned the IPCC and other sources. And we also have two frameworks that are actually quite useful and that can probably give us a lot of the relevant information and data that we would also need to assess progress on adaptation. And I'm thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. I think in both cases, especially maybe the Sendai framework, they have actually succeeded in establishing frameworks where you can measure or assess progress at a global level or at a country level and over time, while still preserving the sovereignty of nations to really respond to and pay most emphasis on the topics that are relevant in the national context. And that is crucial for the processes under the UNFCCC and for assessing adaptation at the global level. So tomorrow we'll be having a lot more detail on what is in the Adaptation Gap report. I hope you can join that discussion as well. But for now, I'll end it here so we have time for the discussion as well. Thank you.
Adaptation. It always looks easy, but now I'm finding it very difficult even. We have our partner, Avina. Where is Avina? Yes, can you say something? Then we can open the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for this very interesting conversation. I'm from Fundación Paula Ellinger, from Fundación Avina, and member of the Center for Climate Change and Decision Making in Latin America. We are about to start a project with IDRC on strengthening capacities to implement adaptation policies in the region. And our aim is to identify where knowledge gaps are for implementing adaptation policies and provide the means for use of the information on adaptation. In this sense, on initial conversations with national government representatives and researchers, one of the key gaps that we find is on how to measure adaptation. And so I'm very glad to see the discussion going in the same direction. From initial conversations, the challenges that we find are very much aligned with everything that you already mentioned. And in that sense, I would like to address two questions to the panel. One of them is, one of the key challenges is the matter of attribution. So I like your consideration, how do we talk about contribution? If you could explore a little bit more on how to assess contribution of adaptation progress. And the other question would be if you have any recommendations on lessons learned on how to use all the information that already exists on indicators for adaptation and bringing it closer to policymakers and implementing information. Thank you.
Thanks, Avina. We have also in the room colleagues from the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support Team, which is a partner in this particular aspect. And I'll be looking forward to some of you to contribute in respect to your experiences in Africa and different countries. The floor is now open. We need to have the first 5 questions so that we already have one set of questions by Avina. If we can get a few so that we can give an opportunity to the panelists to, and if possible, let's try to see, you remember what our colleague Florine did indicate, what's happening at why we're here in Bonn, at the bigger picture, because countries also pay special attention to the architecture that they're trying to construct under the Paris Agreement, and therefore we need to see how do we inform those processes, because countries will be reporting about it, and therefore we need to see how do we influence that. So can I get the first set? Yes, first one, second, third, number 4, number 5. So please go ahead.
This is Avinash Tyagi from International Commission of Irrigation and Drainage.
And if it's possible, you point who you...
Yeah. My question is to Madam Edith, sorry. Why are we looking for a separate framework when we have got SDG framework already therein? Why don't we make certain factors applicable to those indicators and those monitoring mechanisms to really incorporate that's the 13th SDG goals, 13th, to look at what we are trying to achieve here. Because most of the actions which we are looking for are already being done. Of course, there are a number of new actions which are required for climate change perspective. For example, our friend from Vietnam just mentioned about an irrigated area, basically, yield increase. There's already an indicator in there under number 6, basically, right? So why are we really looking at that? Have we tried to incorporate within our SDG framework some of these issues which we are trying to address here or not? Thank you.
Good. Number 2.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Ahmed from the Ministry of Environment in Jordan. My question is, when we are talking about mitigation, actually we have a reference when we say, for example, the CO2 equivalent. Okay, we have like a unit, let's say a unit, and at the same time also we have a reference year or maybe business as usual. But when we are talking about the adaptation, we don't have reference. This means that we can put ambition to be measured at all. So why not to set, for example, how much money we are saving, how many souls we are saving, for example, or how many hectares, or and any reference. We don't have any units and any reference for the adaptation projects. Why and what we can do? That's my question.
So you need to come. What is the best plan? You have number 3 here?
Yes, I'm Charles Tono. I'm a researcher with the African Center for Technology Studies based in Nairobi. I think yesterday we started focusing, especially raising the question about data. And my question is especially to the drafters of the GAB report. And did you experience a point whereby there was conflict in terms of source of data and the data sets that are put together to analyze, to arrive at particular decisions? How are those conflicts managed, considering their different stakeholders, and especially using the political economist approaches? How are the politicians really appreciating the data that was used? Because remember, we are going to make reference in our decisions, especially in engaging with the stakeholders, especially in Africa. Thank you.
I'm Thomas Lelequeten from the Ministry of Environment. Thank you very much for the very important presentation. Kenya, sorry. Yeah, my question is just like, I'll direct it to my colleague from Vietnam. Because I want the practical use of M&E of adaptation. As a country, we already have our UNEP, and we're in the process of implementing that. And what's coming out very clearly is that we should put in place a clear M&E structure. We already have the concept, some indicators, but I just want to learn from you, because you're already ahead of us, you're implementing it already. What are the key challenges that you encountered, especially in data collection? Because for you to measure anything, you have to have baseline. and to collect that data, especially at the local level. I'd like to learn from that. And also, you also have the, like in Kenya, we have the National Monitoring and Evaluation that's under the Ministry of Devolution. They look at development in the country, and they come up with indicators how to measure that. Do you have similar situation, and how do you link the indicators for adaptation? I know they are very close, or how do you work with the Ministry of Planning? Maybe we have that on the national indicators vis-a-vis the indicators you have specifically for adaptation. Thank you very much.
We're going to get another round. I'll put you on notice. It's bad that I know you. I know Mozambique is preparing an app. What are the lessons that you are encountering, or challenges, or whatever that you can share? And any other country that is doing an app process, I think that would be very good. So, who's going to start? Edith, there was specific reference to you, and then to you, and any other who wants to, and Vietnam, and okay, quickly, very brief, so that we allow more people.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I didn't present the bit where we are looking at the coherence between the adaptation goal and the SDG 13, where we're looking at the alignment. But within the context of the country, they need to also have a framework where they can define what is the adaptation goal. What is it that they want to achieve at that particular local context, even though they are working within the bigger framework of the SDG. And I think what we need to recognize as well is that adaptation is quite local, and it also depends on what decisions country make in terms of targets and in terms of what they want to pursue. So the framework allows flexibility in terms of defining what you want to achieve as a country, but working within the bigger framework of the SDG, because there is alignment. Yeah.
So I'll try to respond to the one about the missing metrics, or the lack of a universal metric for adaptation, and also the one directed specifically to me about if we've experienced any conflicts about data. So getting back to the universal metric, or the lack of a universal metric first, well, yes, we do not have a universal metric. I don't think we'll ever get one for adaptation. It doesn't make sense. Adaptation is much more closely aligned to, or comparable to, development, and usually we don't talk about one single indicator or metric for development either, perhaps apart from the Human Development Index. So I don't think we should be looking for one. I think we should focus much more on what are the core sort of set of indicators that we want to track that give us a meaningful interpretation and understanding of what is happening on adaptation. And I think that's something that needs to go on at all levels, and it's very different depending on whether you're looking what is relevant to see in a global context, what is relevant from a national perspective, and what is relevant in a local context. So I think for me it's useful to think it in terms of a triangular approach, where the amount of information that makes sense to track at global level is probably the top of the iceberg, and as you move down more towards the local level, you need more nuanced information. You probably need more information as well to be able to get all the different aspects and facets of development and adaptation that are relevant to make useful decisions. It's funny because we focus a lot on the lack of a universal metric, and I think it's because we always compare adaptation to mitigation. But we should really think about adaptation in terms of development more than as a similar to mitigation. And if you look at it in development, I mean, there's no question about this. Development is local, it's context specific, and that's the same for adaptation, but we would never say, oh, development is local and context specific, so it doesn't make sense to look at it from a global perspective. And I think we need to change our mindset and really get more into that mode of thinking when we talk about resilience, vulnerability, and adaptation overall. On the conflicts between data, well, I can say for sure this year we don't have any conflicts because we are operating at a very sort of high level, more methodological and conceptual level. And what does it take to make assess progress at a global level? Also involving some of the issues that Edith touched upon and that Leah also touched upon. So we haven't experienced anything. We did one last year, an adaptation gap report focusing on finance gaps. And of course, with that, we did experience a lot of, maybe not conflicts, but at least contradictions between data, and also illustrating that even in this area where we actually thought it would be pretty straightforward to get to a specific, because we do have a specific metrics when we're talking funding, and we can use money. But it was super difficult, and it showed that the ways that countries assess the costs of adaptation at a national or subnational level are very different, against very different baselines for very different purposes, and including a lot of different aspects. So it makes even comparison in that field very difficult. And that does show the need, if we want to be able to make some broader line conclusions, we do need approaches that are more comparable across different locations and over time.
Can I follow that really quickly? I just have a quick response to the gentleman from Jordan and to follow up. From a methodological perspective, it's absolutely possible to measure progress in adaptation. It does require an extra layer of nuance. For example, in Jordan, you might be dealing with drought issues, food security issues, grain price, yield. What we're doing, I think, in adaptation is trying to compare outcomes. And so looking back and seeing what were the outcomes of an event. So taking some cues from disaster risk and seeing what were the lives lost, what was the price increase in food security, right? How many refugees were induced? It's very specific to that particular event, but if we can measure that event, use that event as a threshold, and then when that event occurs again after adaptation has been either implemented successfully or at least has been implemented in preliminary stages, we can measure progress. You know, what were the lives saved this next time around? We do this a lot with floods and hurricanes in the U.S., and it proves very effective, at least in the meteorological community. So it is very possible, and we're going to get there.
So, yes. Organizing my thoughts. I'd like to come back to the very first question about attribution and contribution, but also contribute to this unit reference year question. I think you've touched upon a tricky one because we all have something to say. This is Mohammed's question. The concept of attribution, which relates to unit of analysis, is really about what proportion of impacts can we blame on climate change versus other socioeconomic or other determinants. And usually this implies that we can quantify this sort of thing. So Nick gives excellent examples of where attribution might be feasible, where we have a very specific event, what we might call a natural experiment, or we've also talked about quasi-experiments, a very specific event where we can attempt to confidently say climate change contributed to the following number of deaths, and if we adapt, we can offset those deaths or whatever that impact is. When you scale up to the global level over a large number of countries and over the long term, that tends to break down. And the ability to quantify, you can quantify anything, but the ability to reliably and confidently quantify the link between climate and specific impacts and the success of adaptation measures really becomes conceptually non-feasible, at least to date. We haven't figured out anything where the gains of quantifying outweigh the sacrifices of having measures that just don't mean anything. So the adaptation community, until we can find something better at these more higher levels, is moving away from attribution and towards ideas of contribution. So contribution tends to be more qualitative, and the idea here is we can't put numbers on this, but we can tell a story. And you can think about the example that was given to me the other day, that was an excellent one, was think about a defense. Can you defend the alignment or the coherence of actions? Can you defend the likelihood that these actions actually had impact? So you can think of things like, is there a reason to believe that these outcomes arose in some way from these particular actions? Is there reason to believe that these targets are are actually reflective, are actually reflecting risk. So contribution is much more about telling convincing stories that suggest that there actually has been a contribution of actions to outputs. I haven't totally given up, like Anne, that we will never find some sort of usable unit of analysis and or be better able to do attribution research and quantify, but I can quite confidently say at this point we have no methods that have any reasonable amount of consensus. So come back in 10 years and maybe we'll have an answer.
So to address the question about the key challenges when applying the indicators at local. So as I mentioned earlier, the two challenges that we accounting before, the first one, the key one, the first one is the capacity in the province. The capacity includes the human capacity and technological capacity and financial capacity. So when you go to a province and most of people don't understand why you need to measure the adaptation because they just care about like, okay, I have done that project, so it's good enough, it's succeeded, and so I finish it. So why now do I need to measure the effort of adaptation I just have done there? So to explain to them like why we have to do that and do this. So it's one of the things like we need to face when we apply the indicators. And the second thing is about the technological capacity, because in a lot of places, like for example, there's no data for salt intrusion because there's lack of equipment to measure the salt in the rivers or in how it's intrude in the land. For example, like that. So that's the problem. Like we link to the data, the tough to get the data for the indicator, to apply the indicator as well, and the inconsistent in the data. A lot of when you try to collect the data for the indicators, and when you go to the community level and you get you try to approach the project base and you get the data from there at the community levels, and you can get somehow that kind of data. But when you go to like management organization, maybe you can get a little bit different data. So maybe the inconsistent in data collection is another challenge at the provincial level.
Thank you. My name is Timo Leiter. I work with GIZ, the German Development Agency, and I'm also one of the lead authors of the Adaptation Gap Report. So I've got the same points that the panel had. On the question of NAP and M&E, I just wanted to highlight to you the Least Developed Countries Expert Group and GIZ have developed guidance materials on how to do M&E for the NAP process. You can find them on our website, adaptationcommunity.net. It is an official supplementary materials to the UNFCCC LEC technical guidelines for the NAP process. And then I wanted to respond to the colleague from India who asked about the SDG monitoring and adaptation monitoring. In fact, it's of course important to try to see where are the synergies between monitoring for the SDGs and the Sendai framework and adaptation. So that's important. On the other hand, if you only monitor the global SDG indicators, which for adaptation are very, let's say, less ambitious. There are, for example, a number of countries which submitted a plan, which from day one, since 160 countries have submitted an NDC, from day one that indicator is fulfilled. So by monitoring the global SDG indicators, you do not have enough information to understand the adaptation progress. So you should look for synergies in these three conventions monitoring, but one will not supplement or replace the other. In fact, we've just produced a policy brief on this topic, which you will also find on our website, adaptationcommunity.net. And the final point I wanted to make, for M&E of adaptation, it's always important to look at what is the purpose of M&E? What are you doing it for? Is it for a project M&E or for national M&E? And that will determine what your right indicators are. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nina. I'm from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. I was actually missed during the first round of questions, but I do have two questions. One is, how shall we deal with unintended outcomes and impacts, especially since we have a theory of change at the beginning, and also in terms of measuring the intangible. For example, how do we measure, if we are looking at transforming inequities in communities and using adaptation as an opportunity to do that, how much importance should we also place in measuring, for example, agency, participation, and decision-making among the stakeholders in the community?
Okay, my name is Merin Dambi. I'm a student, a PhD student here in Germany, in Brandenburg University of Technology, Cottbus. And I do my research in climate change adaptation, but I focus on the economic side of, actually I measure the cost, the willingness to pay among local farmers in Kenya who have no income, how much they would be willing to pay for climate change adaptation. So I just wanted to comment something on the problem of the data conflicts. I think when we talk about climate change, we cannot specifically, like for instance, in the case of Africa, maybe Kenya, for instance, we cannot clearly say that it is just the rise of temperature or the decrease in the amount of rainfall that has really, we cannot really find a way in which we can connect it to climate change impacts. So basically, I just want to say that one needs to look at many other factors. For instance, you need to look at the food economy, how it has been affected. You need to look at data coming from the food economy, water economy, and also the issue of how many droughts have occurred over time, and whether those things can actually be connected to the impacts that you are simply talking about in connection to climate change, and also maybe the land use, and especially the historical land use changes.
My name is Winnie Lichuma. I chair the National Gender and Equality Commission in Kenya, and also Secretariat of the African Working Group on Gender and Climate Change. I want to appreciate all the presentation, but now back to you, Edith. The paper you raised was very, very informative, especially raising the questions of the process. Because what we do, we normally get to data that gives us the outcome. But recently, the human rights movement now talks about measuring process as well, because the process is as good as the end result. So I think the challenge that we have with the scientists, they would want to go for the outcome. But in between the process, that's where you find the community involvement. That's where you find all segments of the community, men, women, children, and the impact on everyone. So maybe the challenge would be the questions you're raising about the process. Do we want also to think about process indicators? So that you are running process indicators and the outcome indicators. Because the process then will give you an answer to the many questions you raised in the presentation. Thanks.
I have 1 minute to give some sort of a grand insight. Thank you for all the various comments. I think it's helpful because it gives us fewer questions that we respond to. You sort of answered them yourselves in some cases. I would like to perhaps end with a comment on this idea of progress. I think that this is one of the grand challenges, is how do we make sure we're assessing what and how things are happening and not just outcomes. And I think we can start to get at that. One of the things that I'd like to see a lot more of is that our outcomes are not simply measures of fewer deaths or the existence of a plan, but we can begin to look at indicators, and there's various words. I've heard biocultural, for example, be used, indicators that we feel are more meaningful and reflect the process. So an indicator might be reducing burden without increasing inequalities, or reducing burden amongst those that are most vulnerable. We could also look at indicators that suggest that a policy has been implemented with an adequate stakeholder process. So I think actually the idea of getting process and going back to the drawing board, thinking about our priorities, what our priorities are, rather than being driven by data. I think we need not to start with the data and decide what indicators we have, but decide what we want to know and collect data to inform those indicators. And I think that's where we'll get at these more meaningful assessment measures. So I'll leave it there.
So I'll also just end with a very few words. Actually, on the process outcome indicators, what we have now mainly is on process and inputs, not so much on outputs, results, and outcomes on adaptation and resilience issues. So, and we need both, and I fully agree with everything that Leah said. I think what we tend to do is we focus a lot on the challenges and what we don't have and the methodologies that are lacking and so forth, but we're actually also making a lot of progress, and we can see that in practice, and this was about joining or getting from the more methodology and more theoretical towards practice. And I think also your presentation, Ang, and what we see on the ground is that countries are doing a lot on this, and at the very local level, a lot is happening. So I think that we should not only focus on the challenges, but actually focus more on what is already happening and how can we make sense of that and make sure that we utilize and build on what is already being established, what is already established, and what is already going on. Thank you.
On my part, I think from what I read, both from negotiations and as a practitioner, policy at the local level, it's very clear that adaptation is an area of interest. Countries have picked up. They are doing something. There are still many answers. And a typical example is what Kenya has given, where they have an app, but now they are realizing they need a strengthened M&E or MRV framework. And this is a challenge to many other countries that are already in the process of doing an app. And I take note of the GIZ guidance. And from here, it means that there is still more room for clarifying further so that we can get one, Article 6 implemented, Article 7 implemented, but also we tend to forget that the purpose is in Article 2. And if you look at Article 2, besides the global goal, there is increase the ability to adapt to and foster resilience. So there are two terminologies that are there in the purpose, adaptation and resilience. So how do we deal with that at the country level or at the local level? And so I was going to propose that with the leadership that we have, IDRC, if you can continue with this team of groups and practitioners and institutions, one, to further engage and even look at the guidance that has been referenced to by GIZ and provide further guidance to this process, and also feed into the international negotiations that Florine was just talking about. And I think that will be a very good standpoint. So we don't want to end here, but we want to make sure that the debate we have started today continues, and by the next COP, or maybe in June next year, when we have the next SBs, we should be having another discussion to see how we have improved the knowledge since then up to now, and how it can feed into the emerging Paris Agreement rules and rule book, because we need to feed in there. If we don't feed in there, then countries may never use our knowledge, because for them is to tick a box that they have sent a communication to UNFCCC, and that communication for us is we want quality. And I think IDRC and the partners that are on this table and those that are also on the other side, please, let's work together to further this work so that we can contribute to understanding this terminology of adaptation goal and how do we realize it. With that, thank you very much, and thanks for your patience. And thanks to the panelists.